Hello and welcome to this episode of Physical Attraction. This week we have a guest on the show, economics and finance writer Frances Coppola. She's the author of a book, Quantitative Easing for the People, which argues that central banks and governments should work in concert to ensure that their response to financial crises really helps the economy and the entire economy, rather than just inflating asset prices, as we've seen conventional quantitative easing do. In the first part of our wide-ranging discussion, we demystify the economy and debunk some common misconceptions by asking some basic questions. What's a central bank and what is its role in the economy? What is quantitative easing and what was it intended to do? It was a really fascinating discussion, and it does amaze me how much economics is almost taken for granted and not explained as par for the course in our education, when these ideas and principles affect our lives so much. I hope you enjoy. Okay, so Frances, first off, thanks very much for coming on the show to talk about your book, Quantitative Easing for the People, and the general economic mess that we find ourselves in at the moment. I want to start by asking about your background. So how did you first become involved in finance and thinking about economics more generally? And what's your experience been blogging via Coppola Comment in the last few years?
Well, I started in banks. I fell into banking as a way of earning money after doing music at university, um, and I went and worked for several banks in IT systems, and then I crossed the boundary into the business and worked a lot in finance and in middle office, and in what we call operations, which is where they do payments and things like that. So I got a very broad exposure to how things work, what banks actually do. And it's not what people think. And I was quite surprised after the financial crisis how little people knew about what banks actually do. I would say, including a good many bankers, which was very worrying indeed. So I left banking in 2002 because singing wouldn't let me go, and I wanted to be a decent mum to my kids as well. And I spent a decade being a singer and a teacher and a mum. And then after the financial crisis, there was so much rubbish being talked about banks. I thought, I've got to say something. It doesn't work like this. And so I started writing about banks and finance and about economics, because you can't really do serious discussion about banking after a financial crisis without also discussing macroeconomics, which I had studied in my second degree, in my MBA at Cass Business School. And that's when I started Coppola Comments. And so originally, Coppola Comment was a space for me to just write about the things that were annoying me at the time. As time's gone on, it's developed into really a finance and economics blog.
One thing that I think you've raised this point so validly already is that from the outside, it's kind of amazing that we don't learn more about economics. There's not more economics education that is compulsory or even that easy to find about. You know, I'm a physicist. I'm fairly numerate. I pay a lot of attention to the news, and there are still big swaths of economics that I don't feel like I understand at all. But then there's this Keynes quote about the ideas of economists and political philosophers, whether they're right or wrong, essentially run the world. And I feel that is so true, and it leads to a disenfranchisement, I think, amongst ordinary people who see these things going on and don't necessarily understand the full context. And I mean, our muddled perceptions about the economy can lead to all sorts of different incorrect ideas about how things really function. So, for example, in the UK, we had a government that came in 2010 and imposed austerity and cuts. And the analogy that was used to justify that is the government as having finances like a household's finances, where you can't go over budget and you have to pay down debts, as soon as you can, essentially. And that has been used to justify cuts to government spending in the UK. It's also a bit of a boogeyman in the US, where usually whichever party is opposing the government's proposed spending increase is the one that starts railing about the deficit and saying that we can't live beyond our means and so on. But similarly, when we talk about QE, which we will in a little bit, quantitative easing, it's easy for this to be misrepresented as money being printed that's going straight to CEOs of corporations, or taxpayer money is somehow being used to bail out corporations. So given all of this, and this is a very broad question, but what are the sort of misconceptions about the general economy that are widespread or being used politically that you would like to correct?
I think people are very open to simple explanations that sound convincing, that people can envisage, they can hang on to it, means something to them in terms of their own lives. But the reality at the aggregate level and at the governmental level is actually very different. So this argument, for example, that government households finances are like a household. And yet, when we talk about paying down debt as quickly as possible, that's actually not what households do. We all, households take out mortgages over 25 years, but somehow it's not okay for a government to borrow over 25 years. So actually the household analogy, if we actually took it as it really is, as households actually live, isn't terrible. So if you are a household that's not earning enough, you might go and look for a job that pays you more. So you boost your income. You might take on a second job to boost your income. Households do this. And this is actually kind of what governments do as well. There are two ways of increasing of paying down your deficit. One is to cut your spending, but another is to increase your income. And so after the financial crisis, there was a huge debate over how we should go around getting rid of this 10% or so deficit in relation to what we call GDP at the time, which is national income. And all the discussions seem to centre around we've got to cut to get it down. We've got to reduce our spending. And the voices saying, actually, what we need to do is to increase our income kind of got a bit lost. And I think this was unfortunate because as it panned out, the cuts to spending, when a government cuts spending, very often it can cut things that can actually help to increase its income. So, for example, after the financial crisis, in the early years of the coalition government, they cut government investment very considerably. And now government investment kickstarts economic growth. It can help businesses to thrive. It can help people to find better jobs. And so we can actually end up poorer because we're cutting government spending. It's a false economy. But these kind of messages never quite got through. We actually did not discuss even government like a household or like a corporation. We discussed it like something that doesn't actually exist at all. We discussed it in terms of slogans, living within our means, tightening our belts, paying down our credit cards. It wasn't real. It was ideological. And I think sometimes you have to start talking about how things really are to try and counter the ideology that is driving the debate.
And I think this is what's so strange to me about the fact that. I want to give you an example. There is a general the way, as I understand it, there are two large schools in economics, and you can sort of talk about them specifically and how they would respond to a crisis. So you have your Keynesians, who say that you need government borrowing and increasing aggregate demand by spending in sort of big infrastructure type projects when you're in the midst of a recession. And then there are sort of, I guess you would call them the Austrian school, who would say that you need the recession to happen to rebalance the economy. And one thing that I find is interesting is actually, if you look at popular ways of learning about the economy, so I'm talking about YouTube, I'm talking about bloggers and podcasts and so on, the Austrian school seems to be so much more the dominant force in these things. Now, I know from your blog that you don't really identify as being part of either of these particular movements, and perhaps I'm sort of oversimplifying the ways in which people talk about the economy. So first off, do you think that that's fair? And secondly, if those are the schools of debate, where are the sort of flaws in their thinking about how the economy works?
I don't see it quite like that. I think what happened was
Okay.
we had a mainstream economics movement over the last 40 years or so, which is often sort of broadly termed neoliberal, or and you'll sometimes see it called neo-Keynesian as well, which confuses things considerably. And then since the financial crisis, we've had the emergence of a range of alternative schools, one of which is actually the Austrian school, but there are others, the heterodox community generally. I mean, modern monetary theory is another one. that have emerged broadly since the financial crisis and challenged that mainstream neoclassical dominant paradigm that was roughly born really in round about the 1970s when the Keynesian school, which had dominated since World War II, really, failed to be able to deal with the high inflation and poor growth of that time. Um, we shifted to a different paradigm that was roughly based upon free markets and monetarism, we might say. Now, even that is being challenged, and I think we're shifting to another paradigm, and we don't yet know what that is. It's emergent. So it'll be very interesting to see what becomes mainstream economics in the next 40 years.
So we talked about this then, that the sort of mainstream economics at the moment is this neoliberalism, so to speak. I mean, how would you describe that? Because you've said that it's about the power of the free markets, which sort of implies to me that government intervention in these things is quite small. But how would you sort of describe the tenets of the economics that we have at the moment that's maybe going to be cast in the by the wayside in the next few years?
Um, it is broadly about that. It's about saying that it is really all about markets. It's all about that. It's about getting about the way and letting things happen in a way that and government's role within that should be small, and markets should be allowed to operate. Um, and I think underpinning it a kind of philosophical argument that says that all humans are entirely rational and that every decision they ever make is entirely rational and that therefore markets are rational and complete. And I think now we're saying, well, actually, that's not true. And it became apparent first in finance with the financial crisis when it was very evident that there was a lot of stuff going on in finance. It was anything but rational, and that the financial markets were anything but complete and were not broadly in equilibrium all the time. They were very far from equilibrium a lot of the time, and they were prone to panics and herding behavior and all manner of pretty irrational things like that, which is kind of harking back really to Keynes, um, who rather ruefully after remarked that the markets can remain irrational longer than you can remain solvent, after he lost rather a lot of money in the Wall Street crash. Sometimes we need to remember things of the past, and in a mainstream paradigm, things like that, the irrational behavior of markets, becomes lost in what amounted to a belief that everybody would be entirely rational all of the time, or more correctly, that although individual decisions may be rational, it may be totally rational for you as an individual to dump all your your holdings in one particular stock or something like that. When everybody does it, what you end up with is a panic. So it may be totally rational for you as an individual to take all of your savings out of Northern Rock. But when everybody tries to do it all at the same time, you get long queues outside the bank and the bank goes bust. Yeah. So in aggregate, people in
Aggregate rational decisions can still look irrational.
look irrational. And I mean, we see this actually perhaps more evidently, not in places like finance, where you can say, well, rationally, actually, the entire crowd was being rational in taking its savings out of Northern Rock. But in, for example, the behavior of crowds, no, that individually people within that crowd are behaving in a way that is rational to them, but the crowd itself looks like it's out of control and gone mad. We do see a lot of that type of herding behavior in financial markets, and of course one of the things that's happened in the last 40 years during the neoliberal paradigm really has been financial markets have become extremely dominant. They've become like the lifeblood, the driving force behind the economy. And so you could say that a lot of things that go on in the economy itself are driven by this kind of sort of irrational herding behavior.
So when we talk about irrationality in the financial markets, I mean, I think it's very interesting. So you have this sort of Keynesian idea that everything is about the bull and the bear, and the value of the sort of the strength of the economy and the strength of the markets is all down to sentiment and not actually fundamentals at all, not actually what is going on in what we would ordinarily consider the real economy. And in some ways, it seems to me like this is evidence now in the middle of the coronavirus crisis, where we had in March the markets crashed and sold off by 20-25% in total, and then they've immediately, well, many of the markets have almost rebounded to where they were before the crash, despite the fact that what's actually happened in the real economy in that time is that governments have spent very large amounts of money on stimulating the economy, and lots of people are unemployed, and more people will become unemployed, and various businesses have made losses. So it almost seems like the markets are detached from what we consider to be the real economy. I mean, is that a failure of rationality, or is that something else?
Um, it does appear irrational. I mean, actually, the market crash in March didn't look irrational at all. Um,
No, the world was ending at the time.
Absolutely. I looked at this and think, how can anybody consider a panic under these circumstances irrational? It's like the massive crash that there was in 1914, just before the outbreak of World War One, and there was this enormous financial crisis, which never gets talked about because actually it was just everybody running for the hills, and you could see why they were. Really, so the market crash in March was not irrational in that sense. It wasn't some kind of ridiculous stampede caused by the shadow of the wolf in the woods. There really was a wolf, and the herd really did run away from it. I think what has happened since is there's a degree of confidence has been restored, and I think there's two parts to that. I mean, markets are all about confidence. They will. Investors will act in a rational and stable manner if they feel confident. If they get spooked, they run. They're like cattle, really. So what's happened is that the farmers come in and given them a whole load of feed, and they've all clustered around the feed, and the sheepdogs around frightening off the wolf, and so they've got a degree of confidence back, and that's why markets are up. Is that they're going, okay, so the world isn't coming to an end. Central banks have our backs. It isn't going to be a financial crisis. Yeah, there's going to be a big economic crash, but actually, when there's a big economic crash, there are opportunities for investors. So if we hang on in here, we'll make some money. That's what's going on.
It's very interesting. And one final thing I want to talk about in terms of this financial rationality and irrationality on the markets. We talked a little bit, and we're going to talk now about the 2008-2009 financial crisis, and this idea that everyone is making rational decisions on investments.
Mm.
The key defining the proximate cause of the financial crisis was that, as I understand it, you had lots of subprime mortgages, which weren't necessarily good loans, that had been repackaged and financialized into instruments, collateralized debt obligations, and these were sold to various different banks in various different packages. And what actually happened was you have this idea of the Homo economicus, right, who's always making rational decisions about what to purchase and what not to purchase, and how to behave in a transaction to maximize their own benefit. But that requires them to have good information about what it is that they're buying. And in that particular case, part of the issue was that the collateralized debts that people were buying, they had no idea what was really in them, and to what extent some of the loans were going to go bad. And so in terms of rationality and irrationality, I mean, could you say that it was this information, this lack of perfect information about what was going on, and the lack of perfect information that people have when they're considering uncertainty, such as the uncertainty surrounding this crisis, or the uncertainty then surrounding whether a bank could make good on its loans to you or not, or whether your assets were worth anything or not, that causes people to end up being driven by sentiment rather than a sort of cold, rational decision-making process?
Yes, absolutely. In fact, that is a limitation on what's known as the efficient markets theory, which basically says that when everybody has access to the same information, they will all make the decisions they make will all be rational. When we have information asymmetry, where some people have more information than others, and you get distortions creeping in. Basically, there are hustlers and suckers, because the people who have less information can be taken for fools. And when that happens to the whole market, when you've got a relatively small number of players taking the rest of the market for fools, you end up with something like 2008. So you might ask yourself, and I've asked myself this a number of times, it's always been, why did they buy? If they didn't know anything about these things, they didn't do the due diligence to find out what was underpinned them. In some cases, they even knew that what underpinned them was toxic waste, and they still bought them. And you have to ask yourself why. And there are a number of reasons for this. There is the beauty contest effect, where the value of something is how much you think something is worth is driven by how much you think somebody else thinks it's worth. If you see what I mean, does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, which is
Yes, no, I think so. I mean, particularly if you don't think that it bears any relation, it's just about what people are willing to pay for it, right?
Yeah, it's the Keynesian beauty contest. I mean, Keynes, with this way, way of words, with words and images, described it as a beauty contest in which your decision about which girl you think to vote for is not the one that you think is most beautiful, but the one that you think everybody else thinks is most beautiful. And that's how markets work. And so with subprime, everybody else thought CDOs and CDSs and things were beautiful, and so people voted for them, even if they didn't necessarily think they were beautiful. If you see what I mean, because they were following the herd. That's the point. And there is this fear of missing out thing, where if you don't follow the herd, you're going to miss out on the really nice grass. And there's also I know this is all going to end in tears, but if I get in quick, because I'm cleverer than anybody else, I can get out before it all crashes. And there's a lot of that as well. There's a lot of that kind of sort of believing you're better than everybody else. And we're all guilty of that. I mean, we all think we're better drivers than we actually are. This kind of thing about everybody thinks that their driving is better than average.
Mm-hmm.
Which is obviously,
or that they're more intelligent than average, maybe.
Exactly. Everybody thinks they're more intelligent. And the driving thing has actually been tried out. In surveys, a majority of people think their driving is better than average. I think it's hilarious.
But I never pass my test, so I'm one of those people who doesn't think that. I think my driving is probably objectively slightly worse than average.
That's a little bit like Jane Austen, actually. I think it was Lady Catherine de Bourgh who said I would have been excellent when talking about playing the piano. I would have been an excellent player if I had ever learned.
Oh no! Don't get me wrong. If I had finished my exam, I can guarantee you that I'd be far more sensible than all these idiots on the road at the moment.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, as long as you don't drive a BMW or an Audi.
About people wanting to get in and get out as quickly as they possibly can, because one of the things that I've been watching since this coronavirus crisis started is pretty much any stock that is associated with a vaccine they're almost effectively these pump and dump schemes at the moment, where people will float rumours in the news about such and such a stock is associated with a treatment or a drug, and then everyone buys it and then everyone sells it, because they're all hoping to be the people who buy in at the peak of inflated expectations and sell before the price crashes. And there's a lot of people who are just trying to work markets on the theory of a greater fool, that a greater fool is going to be a counterparty to their trade, and they will make money by outwitting the other people who are in the market at the moment. And the idea that this is sort of the sentiment that plays at the moment, that people don't even necessarily buy things based on the expected underlying value, but purely because they expect to be able to con someone else into buying it at a different nominal price.
Yeah, I mean, actually, markets do work like that to some extent. It's sad. We like to think that everybody is buying decisions based upon what they think is the underlying value, and there are people who do. But there are also these kind of momentum traders who are simply riding the wave. And there are also people who are actively playing the market, talking it up, because they want to profit from the rise. Actually, there are regulations in place to stop this kind of thing, and they work to some extent. And actually, if you want to see what a completely unregulated financial market looks like, you actually need to look at cryptocurrency, where this kind of thing happens all the time, and there's really no value at all that isn't caused by somebody talking it up in order to get other people to buy in.
Yes, well, you see, I've been a technology journalist in the past, like a freelance technology journalist, and I was one of the people who was very much saying, what actually is the point of all of these cryptocurrencies? What can the blockchain do? What can Bitcoin do other than be an extremely inefficient way of making payments from person to person that uses a hell of a lot of energy and a hell of a lot of computing power per transaction, and that actually is really only purpose is if you do want to do something criminal where you can be completely anonymous in it. And yet the value of these things is divorced from their real value, and is I mean, particularly when it comes to lots of the smaller cryptocurrencies, which are, as you say, just these pump and dump schemes that people are putting money into and talking up and then talking down in the hope that they'll be able to sell them on to a greater fool. But it seems it's almost a more cynical version of the dot-com bubble, because I don't even know whether there's going to be lasting uses of blockchain or Bitcoin beyond just as instruments of financial speculation. I don't know what your
I'm
perspective is on
I,
cryptocurrencies.
I'm still trying to believe that there is some kind of lasting value there, but I'm as time goes on, I'm seeing less and less evidence of it, which is quite sad, really, isn't it? It started after the financial crisis. I think sort of traumatically after the financial crisis, there was a massive breakdown of trust in the financial system at that time. So it's not surprising that people were trying to create an alternative to it, and it wasn't the only movement at that time that was trying to create an alternative to the present financial system. We also had moves towards full reserve banking and all sorts of things at the time. But as time's gone on, rather than trying to create an alternative to the financial system, they seem to have tied themselves to it with ropes of steel, called stablecoins, and are now and it's become simply a vehicle for speculation, as you say. I think they've sold their soul, really.
Yes, it is interesting, and I think actually QE probably did play some part in this. So we're going to get onto the meat of your book and the topic at hand today. Now, sorry everyone for the interesting digressions that we got into at the start. So I just wanted to ask a very basic question: what is a central bank, and what role do they play in the economy?
Well, it's very interesting about central banks and the role they play, because they don't play the role now that they did when they were first created. Central banks go back a long time. The Bank of England was founded in 1684 or something like that. But most of them were originally founded to finance government, particularly to finance wars. Um, and even well into the 20th century, financing government one way or another was the primary purpose of central banks, really, being the government's bank, um, issuing the currency, obviously, um, and managing the value of the currency. That's the bit that we still have, but we do it in a different way now, because for most of the period in which central banks have been operating, central banks have managed the external value of the currency. So they've managed exchange rates, and when we've been on a gold standard, they've managed gold flows. Since 1971, we've not had a gold standard, and increasingly we've been dropping managed exchange rates. I think sort of free floats really have been established among developed countries pretty much since the early 1990s. And that's around the time that, as part of the neoliberal and monetarist revolution, the value of an independent central bank that was disconnected from government and was not responsible for financing it became a matter of economic faith. So your central bank should not be financing your government, because it could end up financing governments to a ridiculous extent, and then you ended up with Weimar and wheelbarrows and confetti money. So what you should have is a central bank that is independent of government. Government should finance itself in the markets and be subject to the discipline of the markets, so that it can't spend so much that it debases the currency, and that the central bank should be responsible for managing the value of that currency, but increasingly not by managing its external value, but by managing its internal value, by which I mean the rate of inflation. Now, inflation needs a little bit of explanation, because if you talk to the Austrian school, or if you talk to Bitcoiners, since we were just talking about Bitcoin, they take inflation to mean the actual amount of currency in circulation. So the rate of growth of actual currency in circulation. So if you increase your money supply by 10%, you've got a 10% inflation rate. But the general economic definition of inflation is not that. The general economic definition of inflation and the measure that central banks use to determine the inflation level and to determine the level they should be targeting, what they should be targeting, is actually a rise in the general price level. So if your consumer prices are in general rising at 2% per year, then you have 2% inflation. And there's whole books written on how this works and the different measures that they use and the different way they construct it and how they measure it and the problems with that and all the rest of it. But I think just drawing the distinction between those two definitions of inflation is quite important, because when you talk to, like I said, hard money types, they do mean something different by inflation.
There is a perception that inflation is purely about how much currency you have, and this is the classic idea that when you print money, you devalue the rest of the money, and so on.
Yeah.
And then there's perhaps the more accurate perception of what inflation is you take for example, a basket of goods that people might buy, and that's the consumer price index, and then it's about the purchasing power of your dollar or your pound to actually obtain physical assets. Is that a fair
Yeah, to
summary?
obtain to obtain the goods in that basket. We don't actually currently generally include uh, investment assets in that, because the problem with including investment assets, and that includes property, is that actually, whereas generally speaking people regard price rises in consumer goods as not a terribly good thing, really, they are rather keen on asset price rises. So a central bank trying to keep their their property from rising by only 2% a year kind of tends to get outrage headlines in the Daily Mail. It is an open question whether asset price inflation should in fact be included. And I know the Office for National Statistics here in the UK has been starting to include housing costs, but not the actual rise in house prices. And that's a kind of an interesting distinction. Um, yeah, but housing costs are sort of broadly, you can roughly interpret it as being, it's kind of including rentals, but not house prices.
So it's a little bit like the cost of someone to live in the economy at the moment. How much is that going up versus the value of, say, their investment, their assets, their house, their stocks, and so on?
Absolutely. And so, I mean, with property, for example, we have a thing called imputed rentals, which is the amount that the householder would have to pay if they were paying rent for their own house. And that's not the same as their mortgage.
Mm-hmm.
It is included in the measure of housing costs. But at the moment, um, certainly the Bank of England isn't using the version of CPI that includes housing costs. The CPIH isn't using that as its preferred measure of inflation. It's actually using actually using CPI itself, which, as I said, is the basket of goods, and it's using
Mm-hmm.
the core version of that, which excludes some types of goods that are highly volatile.
So, returning again to this question of central banks, I just want to sort of paint a picture and you can tell me how wrong it is. So, we had pre 1970s, and particularly very early on, the central bank had all of the gold, issued the currency in terms of printing the money as the Royal Mint would do, um, and backed the currency against the gold reserves that it had. Now we've all shifted away from the gold standard. It gets its value more from what people think it's worth as opposed to any physical backing. Um, and the central bank's role is in setting interest rates and in, again, creating money. But other banks also create money. Is this correct?
Yes, that's right. And if I just unpack that a bit, I think this is
Yes,
really
please do.
important. The currency as we have it now is not backed by any physical commodity. There's no gold or silver or asset of any kind backing the currency at the moment. What it's backed by is actually the future productive capacity of the economy. You could say you could say it represents future tax receipts. That's one way of looking at it, and that plays to the chartalist idea that the value of the currency is given by the government's ability to tax.
Mm-hmm.
Um, no, but it's definitely the value of your currency is determined by the future productive capacity of your economy. And so, in a way, your inflation rate, if your these days, when you're sort of judging inflation, central banks do it on what they call expectations rather than on current inflation. They look ahead and say, what do people expect inflation to be in 5 years' time? And if the expectations are that inflation is going to be in double digits in 5 years' time, then in a way it's saying that the productive capacity of the economy is not enough to preserve the value of the currency. You've got too much currency in relation to the future capability of your economy. So maybe you need to do something to improve your productive capacity. Or maybe you need to reduce the amount of currency, the amount of money you have sloshing around. Um, that's roughly how that works. Um, and it can be quite hard for people to get their heads around this. And again, it's one of these um, areas where it's very easy to cling on to a simple idea. You can understand a currency that is backed by something you can kick, like gold.
Yes.
But the idea that it's backed by this kind of ephemeral notion of what the future, what the people of the economy can produce over the next however many years, including people who are currently children and aren't even born yet, is actually that's actually much more difficult to get your head around. But that's
Mhm.
actually how fiat currencies work. Um,
So a fiat currency is almost like the stock value of UK PLC, and when people lose confidence in the company's future profitability, so to speak, that's when the value of the currency goes down, as we saw after the Brexit referendum, for example.
I think it's an absolutely brilliant analogy. In fact, when I talk about, um, fiat currency notes and coins, I often say it's not a debt. It's not an IOU. It's not redeemable as anything other than itself. You take your £10 note and you go to the Bank of England, and they will give you a £10 note, or they'll give you £10 coins. They won't give you any asset. They can't give you anything else. It's redeemable only as itself. But it is, in a way, a kind of share in the future of the country. So in that way, I think money, currency in this way, is often better regarded as sort of like a type of share, like a type of stock investment, if you like, rather than as any kind of debt.
And just as a company can issue new shares to sell them off and raise capital that it needs for itself, I suppose a country can issue new shares in the sense of making more money, printing more money. Is that a
Absolutely.
fair analogy or not? Yeah. Okay.
It's not a bad, again, it's not a bad analogy. So if a corporation did a rights issue, which means it would be inviting its existing shareholders, issuing new shares and inviting its existing shareholders to buy them, um, then what happens is the share price falls because obviously those existing shareholders will have more shares for the same
Hmm.
company. So they've been what we call diluted. But if the company then uses that money to invest for the future, then the future growth of that company could be much more than it would be without the rights issue. And so actually you can find your share price sort of falls initially and then climbs. And
Because
that
people are more confident in the company now that it has more cash on its books.
absolutely. And so if you are issuing more money, and you're going to use that money to invest in the supply, in the productive capacity of your economy, then you are potentially actually making your currency in the future more valuable, not less.
So let's talk about the meat of this then. Let's talk about quantitative easing. So financial crisis comes along, 2008, 2009. Central banks embark on this big program of quantitative easing. Now, it's very difficult to get a proper perception of what this is. For example, I remember the Bank of England's website used to have a lovely page where they said, lots of people think that quantitative easing is printing money. It's not. Instead, new money is created digitally. Which to me, when I read that, I just thought, well, what's the difference? I'm not concerned about physical money because not all money is physical money. It's all in bank accounts and so on. So, quantitative easing, central banks, what is it and why did they do it?
Quantitative easing is an asset swap. And we haven't talked a great deal about government debt yet,
Mm-hmm.
but it's really important we do, because quantitative easing there's two sides of this. One is the new money, and the other is the government debt, because most quantitative easing involves purchases, the central bank buying the debt of its own government. Um, they sometimes buy other things, So, for example, the Federal Reserve also buys what it calls agency MBS, which is the mortgage-backed securities issued by the government-sponsored enterprises, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. But that's regarded as equivalent to government debt, really. It has a federal
Hmm.
guarantee and so forth. And more recently, central banks have been buying some corporate debt. So the Bank of England bought some corporate debt. Um,
So can I just really briefly interject here and say, so when we say that the Bank of England is buying this debt, it buys debt from governments and corporations in the form of bonds, and the bond is like an asset. And when you have the bond says, okay, we promise to pay you a certain percentage extra on top of the value of this bond, and that percentage will be set by various different things. And that's an asset that the central bank holds. So the central bank is effectively the owner of, in the case of QE1 and later rounds of QE, billions and billions of pounds worth of the government's debt and some corporate debt as well, which it holds as these assets as bonds. And then part of the tax revenue that we pay, for example, goes to paying down the interest on these loans, which is the sort of maturity of the bond. Is that right?
that's right, except that the Bank of England actually remits that interest back to the Treasury, so it doesn't actually profit from its holdings. Um,
Okay.
and there's a deal between the government and the Treasury whereby the central bank doesn't profit from its holdings, but it doesn't take losses either. So if the bonds actually lose value, then the Treasury will reimburse it. But that actually hasn't happened since QE. They actually put that in place just in case it happened, because they honestly thought that it might happen. But what's actually happened, of course, is that government debt has gone up hugely in value since the financial crisis overall. And so, generally speaking, the central banks have been making profits on their holdings. Um, but yeah, that's how it works. So we can regard government debt as being like a future promise of money. So if a government is issuing a bond to its own citizens, then it's then in return for money contributed by those citizens. So if I, as a private citizen, buy a government bond worth, say, some notional amount of money, like £10,000, I would have to pay whatever the market value is, which is probably maybe a bit less than £10,000, right? The government will have that money, but then in the future, I've got a right to have that money back. So in a way, I have relinquished money in the present, um, and will get it back in the future. And in the meantime, the government has received money in the present, which will return in the future. That's just how lending works generally. But when the government does
Hmm.
it, the money's actually created and destroyed when the government does it, actually. Um, so when the central bank buys a bond, and it does so on the secondary market, it's not buying new issues of bonds. It's not the government issuing bonds that the central bank immediately buys. It's actually buying them um, from investors. Um,
Okay.
the central bank holds that bond, and it pays for it with money that it has created. Whereas if I buy a bond, I'm buying it with money that I have earned or something. Um, when the central bank does that, it buys the bond with money that it has created. And so it's putting new money into the economy. Now, the way it does that, um, it rather depends who it's bought the bond from. If it's bought the bond from a bank, then the new money that it created goes into bank reserves, where it actually doesn't do very much. So very early on in QE, not long after the financial crisis, the Bank of England realised that damaged banks weren't lending, and giving them additional money in the form of reserves wasn't making them lend. And so it decided to buy bonds from investors rather than from banks. Now, when that happens, the new investor isn't a bank, so they're given money. So the money that the central bank creates goes into their deposit account um, at a bank. So the bank also has increased bank reserves as well. But it's the money that goes into their deposit account that matters, because what the investor is then meant to do with it is spend it.
Hmm.
In practice, what happens is investors spend it on other financial assets, because your average investor that the central bank is buying assets from, is pretty rich. and is quite possibly an institutional investor whose job is to manage portfolios of assets. And so what they will do is go and buy other assets. Now, this is actually partly the point, is to encourage institutional investors, particularly, to shift their portfolios towards different assets, away from government debt and towards corporate debt and equities. The idea being to make it easier and cheaper for companies to borrow, to invest. So that was the idea of
I
QE.
see. So if I could just sort of summarize this um, very quickly. So we have the financial crisis. Banks won't lend to each other. The central bank says, time for us to effectively create new money by buying government bonds that are held by these banks. The banks will then have more cash and they will be more willing to lend to each other. They tried that. It didn't really work so well because the banks still didn't lend to each other. So then they thought, okay, there are all of these corporations out there, private investors, institutional investors, pension funds, whatever it may be, who own government debt. We'll buy the government debt from them. They will then have some spare cash and hopefully they'll invest that in other sectors of the economy. And the idea was that this would provide lots of liquidity for people and bring back their confidence and make them invest in different projects. And that would eventually come along and benefit the whole economy. But what actually happened was a lot of these institutional investors didn't invest in things that, so to speak, would trickle down from financial markets into the lives of ordinary people. But instead, they bought assets and asset prices were inflated more. And this is why we have, for example, when the Bank of England looked back at its purchases of bonds, and I think the first rounds of QE were hundreds of billions of pounds that were created in the purchases of these bonds. They found that the effect was to disproportionately benefit wealthy people because wealthy people, of course, disproportionately hold assets. And so if what your program of injecting money into the markets is doing is inflating asset prices, then it's benefiting people who hold assets more than people who don't. Is that a fair summary of sort of the first rounds of QE?
I think that is a fair summary, and it is something pretty much the central banks have admitted that QE does benefit those who hold assets, who are, of course, disproportionately rich people. It also the counter side to that is also, though, that the returns, the yields on assets fall. Um, so anybody who wants a good return on their assets, like a pensioner, actually suffers, um, actually has to take more risk to do it. So one of the adverse effects of QE has been to force people who are saving for retirement to take uh, to take more risks, to have things in their portfolios that are riskier, just in order to get a decent income. It's been a long running problem, and for you might say, well, there are bigger problems than that, and I've said that. Some of my heart bleeds. I'm not very sorry about you suffering from very low interest rates. I care more about people losing their jobs and people losing their homes. But it is a matter of concern that people who had relied on a portfolio delivering a return of 7 or 8%, are suddenly getting returns of 2 or 3%, and it's not enough for them to live on. Um,
So a couple of things that I wanted to ask about really is that this whole process is so mystifying to people from the outside, and they hear that central banks are printing trillions of dollars and these things are going to investors, and it's sort of that is in a way that's kind of how it's happening, but it's a lot more indirect than that. One counter argument that you get when you advance this case is people say QE is described as a loan because the central bank is purchasing an asset, corporate and government debt, which presumably it could then sell again, and then your loan has sort of been repaid. But if the central bank's balance sheet always increases, as I think has been the case for the Bank of England and for the Federal Reserve in the US, where they're buying more and more debt and never selling it back, is it really a loan if the capital doesn't have to be repaid?
this is one of these kind of Jedi mind trick things, isn't it? Whereby,
Yeah,
whereby the central banks have been at pains to say we could sell this back, and everybody's going, yeah, really, and
I would
actually,
love someone to loan me $1 trillion with no obligation to pay it back.
well, of course, the UK government used to issue perpetual debt.
Mhm.
We actually paid some of it off in 2014 because it was expensive, because it had been issued during the Napoleonic Wars. Um, That's an interest rate of about 5%. And interest
200
rate,
years is not perpetual, is it?
well, I could have gone on forever. They had no obligation to call it. They only did so because it was expensive. Because interest rates had fallen so much, it was an expensive way of
Mm-hmm.
financing governments. So they called it and refinanced it over a much shorter time with a maturity date. So it's not perpetual anymore, at a lower interest rate. I mean, but had they not done so, we would still have some perpetual debt. Um, you might ask yourself, why on earth would anybody pay a government perpetual debt? But it used to be quite a good way of investing your money. If what you wanted was a return, because it was a guaranteed return, it was fixed interest rate of 5% or something. Um, and so people did. It was certainly in the 18th, 19th centuries, it was a good way of investing your money. A safe asset was in a form of government debt known as a consol, which was essentially a perpetual loan. So, but that's not what central banks have bought. Well, banks have bought things with maturity dates, and they do mature. And at the moment, when certainly in England, in Britain, when the bonds that the Bank of England has bought mature, it buys some more so that it's maintaining the same um, value of bonds on its balance sheet. When the Fed started unwinding its balance sheet in 2017, it did so by not reinvesting. So as the bonds matured, it didn't replace them, and its balance sheet therefore shrank. So in that sense, what the Fed did at that time is evidence that QE can be unwound. The government effectively did have to repay that money.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
And this is the concern, isn't it? Is
right.
that we've had rounds of QE. It was initially an emergency measure after the financial crisis, but actually we've had to have continual rounds of it since. I think we had one in 2010, one after Brexit, and then another huge one after coronavirus, which we'll get to shortly. But it can be unwound then, providing the economy is booming and the central bank makes the decision to stop reinvesting in this
Yes,
government bonds.
yes, absolutely. And in fact, Andrew Bailey, who's the current governor of the Bank of England, said very recently that if and when the government returns to the kind of health that we would like to see, he would consider reducing the Bank of England's balance sheet before raising interest rates, which is the opposite of what the Fed did, because the Fed started to raise interest rates first and then stopped reinvesting bonds. But yeah, they what they're doing is they are reducing their asset holdings not by selling the assets, but by allowing them to mature, which means they're redeemed, they're repaid. And I think, and because of that, I think that the messaging around QE, there are still people who are saying, "Oh, it'll never be repaid. They'll just print and print and print forever." And I point to the 2 years that the Fed was unwinding its balance sheet and saying, "Well, they actually did repay a lot of it. The Fed reduced its balance sheet by nearly half."
But you see, this is quite interesting because I certainly, insofar as I follow U.S. politics, I know that Donald Trump is constantly going on at the Federal Reserve in the idea that the Federal Reserve's job is to sort of prop up his economy and boost his re-election chances and so on. And this was happening before any of the coronavirus stuff hit, which has obviously put us into a completely new paradigm. But he was always going on at them to slash interest rates and presumably wouldn't have minded QE again. So there's this question of to what extent the government and the central bank should work together, or to what extent they have quite an antagonistic relationship. Could you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, it's actually quite a problem. I mean, there are so many examples of governments really trying to um, tell their central banks what to do. So Donald Trump has said a number of times that he thinks that American interest rates should be lower, for example. Now, actually, this was he started saying it while the Fed was raising rates, and I actually agreed with him. I actually thought that the Fed was raising interest rates too fast and unwinding its balance sheet too fast, and it was all going to end in tears. And then in September last year, it did end in tears. And I thought, I mean, I actually found it quite uncomfortable, actually agreeing with Donald Trump, really. But
Well, even a stop clock is right twice a day. Don't worry about it too much.
but there are other examples, and it is a worry that a central bank that is actively buying its own government's bonds in a way, is having to cooperate perhaps more closely with that government than some people are comfortable with. There are people who want central banks to be sort of fenced around by rules and by legislation that prevents them from doing that. I mean, I think we've seen this in Europe with the ECB, whereby the ECB's QE has been challenged legally, challenged in the courts by Germany, because they have this absolute prohibition on central bank financing of governments, and the some people in Germany thought that QE breaks that prohibition. This is going to come back and to haunt us over the ECB's most recent interventions as well. I am not myself convinced that having these kind of prohibitions is necessarily helpful. Because if you have a government that is so irresponsible as to demand that its central bank finance profligate lending, profligate spending on
And just prints endless money for them to pay their
money
expenses.
for them to pay their cronies and disappear off into their bank accounts and what have you, then your central bank is going to be, your whole government infrastructure is a basket case anyway. Now, if you have an independent central bank, they might be able to that can credibly resist that. You might be able to keep the show on the road for a while. But no government institution, and the central bank is a government institution, is ultimately totally immune to corruption. If you have a government that is determined to seize control of all arms of the state and bend them to its purposes, the central bank can be corrupted. And but that doesn't mean that we should necessarily say, well, because of that, there's no point in having an independent central bank. I think having a central bank at arm's length from the financing of government isn't a bad idea. Um, and I think it can work very well. There is sometimes this question about whether the central bank, even though it's sort of notionally independent, actually still has to do what the government wants simply because it hasn't got any choice because it's responsible for the economy. We saw that particularly, I think, during the coalition years when we had a government that was hell bent on making really very, very deep cuts to government expenditure, and there were tax rises as well, particularly to energy, household energy bills, corporate energy bills, and VAT, of course, at a time when the economy was just heading off a cliff again because the eurozone crisis was just starting. And there is a question about whether the Bank of England actually had to loosen monetary policy because of the tight fiscal stance of the government, and whether even George Osborne constructed his fiscal policy in the expectation that the Bank of England had his back in terms of keeping the economy afloat while he trashed government finances.
So the
Um,
government is pulling one way, and the central bank is sort of expected to pull back because people. I mean, and the point that you make, I suppose, is that when there's a crisis, people look to the central bank to do something, as we saw in the last year.
Yeah, absolutely. We have come to expect that the central bank will prop up the economy, and we've been in that mode for 10 years, and not just in Britain. It's been everywhere that everybody's looked
Hmm.
to their central banks to keep the show on the road, while the government spends all its time cutting back in order to get deficits under control, rather than doing the economy and its citizens need. Um, and if the present crisis forces us to turn away from that incredibly dysfunctional way of doing things, then bring it on. Um, we still do have a tendency to look to the central bank to say, okay, what are you going to do about the economic mess we're in? And I think increasingly it's beginning to dawn on people that the present crisis is so enormous and central banks have so little room for maneuver after um, backstopping fiscal austerity for the last 10 years, that now it is governments that need to step up, and that central banks' role now is becoming backstopping governments to enable them to do whatever it takes to get their economies moving and support their citizens, which is, in my view, more where it should be, really.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Physical Attraction. You can find our guest today, Frances Coppola, on Twitter at Frances Coppola, and you can find her blog on finance and economics at Coppola Comment, complete with some recent thoughts on how to respond to the current economic downturn. And I urge you to give it a read, not only for that, but also for the historical debates about QE and discussion of the latest financial news. You can find us online at physicspodcast.com, where you'll find the contact form. You can get in touch there. Any comments, questions, concerns, topics you'd like to see us cover, topics you wouldn't like to see us cover. We're open to talking about all kinds of subjects on this show, as I'm sure you're appreciating. You can get in touch with us there, and I aim to respond to everyone who gets in touch via that contact form. Other things that you can do via the website, there's the Patreon, where you can subscribe for no money initially, but some small number of dollars. Once we release the next bonus episode, you'll be able to access 6 bonus episodes if you subscribe to us on Patreon, so you could join the dozen or so people who've already done that. You can donate to the show on PayPal if you want to give us a tip to support us in our work and help me pay for the Libsyn fees and all that sort of thing. And one of the best things, of course, you could do to the show if you don't want to support it financially is definitely to tell as many people who might be interested in the show about it. Review us on iTunes or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You know all the stuff. You've listened to plenty of podcasts. You know the kind of things that podcasters would like you to do. You can also follow us on Twitter, PhysicsPod, and Facebook page is Physical Attraction. And the Science Podcasts group, by the way, is up there on Facebook as well. You can find all sorts of stuff about science podcasts there. Most of the people there are fellow science podcasters, so if you're looking for something new to listen to, that might be a good place to do it. Until next time then, take care.